we have Lauren Wenzel and Mimi Diorio with us. Lauren Wenzel is the director of NOAA's National Marine Protected Areas Center, and she focuses on connecting and strengthening the nation's diverse marine and coastal protected area programs through capacity building, information and tools, communication, and collaborative governance. Her focus is on building partnerships among U.S. and international marine and coastal programs and stakeholders to demonstrate the value of protecting the ocean's most important places. Lauren has been with the MPA Center since 2004. And Mimi Diorio is the GIS manager for NOAA's Marine Protected Areas Center. Mimi manages the MPA inventory, which is a comprehensive spatial database of U.S. MPAs. And she is the lead for analyzing patterns and trends and reporting statistics for marine protected areas throughout U.S. waters. And with that, Lauren, I will pass this off to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Shannon. And hello, everybody. Really nice to be with you all. I can't exactly see you all, but looking forward to hearing from you and having a conversation. So I'll just start by saying that I think probably many of you have probably heard and been engaged with America the Beautiful to date. And so some of what we're going to talk about may be familiar. We're going to go over kind of a few of the basics and then talk about some of the recent work that's been happening. This is definitely a work in progress. So some of it is, in development, and we'll just be kind of sharing with you how we're thinking about these things. In a lot of cases, decisions haven't yet been made, but we will be happy to kind of chat with you about where things stand. And I just also wanted to add that, Mimi and I are both from the National Ocean Service. We work in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries in the MPA Center, but this is a broad interagency effort. Folks from all the different agencies are involved, and within NOAA, there's active involvement from NOAA Fisheries and the Office of Atmospheric Research, NOAA Policy. So this is very much a group effort. So you're just hearing from one segment here. With that, I will go ahead and get started on the slides. And what I'm going to do is turn off my camera for now, but I will come back and turn it on when we get into the questions and discussion. So let me just start with some basics. The America the Beautiful initiative comes out of Executive Order 14008, which was signed by President Biden in January 2021, so 2 years ago now. And this was one of the first actions taken by President Biden when he took office. And it directs the agencies, the Interior, Department of Agriculture, Commerce, and CEQ to submit a report recommending steps to achieve the goal of conserving at least 30% of the nation's lands and waters by 2030. And it directs the agencies to work with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, agricultural and forest landowners, fishermen, and other stakeholders to encourage broad participation and to develop guidelines for determining what lands and waters qualify to be classified as conserved. And also directs the agencies to establish mechanisms to measure progress toward 30% and to submit annual progress reports. So that is, where we are. I think it's important to remember that the 30% is not an endpoint, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the vision for America the Beautiful is to address 3 national threats: the loss of natural areas and biodiversity, climate change, and inequitable access to the outdoors. And so the idea was to launch a campaign that was locally led and nationally scaled, that looks at a continuum of approaches to conserve, connect, and restore lands, waters, and wildlife. And here I just wanted to emphasize that, the 30% coverage is what we all hear about. That's the headline, but it's really not the whole story. And so some of the things we're talking about are, how can we really improve conservation outcomes so that, including in existing managed areas. Again, some of the headlines are around new protected areas, but we're really looking across the board at what we manage now and also potential gaps. How can we leverage our conservation investments, including coordination among different types of area-based management? And how can we engage more people in conservation? So those are some of the big efforts that are part of this overall initiative. And to do that, the agencies have identified 8 core principles. Again, if you've been kind of tracking America the Beautiful, these would be familiar to you. And I'll just briefly go over these, to pursue collaborative and inclusive approaches, conserve for the benefit of all people, support locally led efforts, honor tribal sovereignty, pursue approaches that create jobs, honor private property rights and voluntary stewardship efforts, use science as a guide, and build on existing tools and strategies. So those are the broad principles that are guiding this effort. And then following that, the agencies identified 6 areas of focus to begin making early progress. And so the idea here was that these were things where we could really focus in and try to move the needle in the near term. And so these areas of early progress included creating more parks and safe outdoor spaces in nature-deprived communities, supporting tribally led conservation and restoration priorities, expanding collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitats and corridors, so really looking at this issue of connectivity, increasing access for outdoor recreation, incentivizing and rewarding voluntary conservation efforts, and creating jobs. And you'll see that some of these areas of early focus really come through in some of the recent investments that have been approved by Congress in terms of investment in coastal restoration and climate resilience. So, how we're going to measure progress is going to be through the American Conservation and Stewardship Atlas. And so that will provide a baseline of how much U.S. lands and waters are currently conserved and restored, and really allow us to take a look at how we're moving forward over time. There will also be agency-specific conservation action plans. So NOAA has developed a conservation action plan, and other agencies have too. These are all publicly available. And annual progress reports that will include not only the actions people are taking, but also the conditions of fish and wildlife habitats and populations. So Mimi is going to talk more about the Atlas when I'm done. So I'm only going to give you kind of a very broad brush here, and then we can get into the details with Mimi. But basically, the Atlas is going to be a tool to help provide a more accessible and comprehensive picture of conservation and restoration work in America. One of the things that we've found is that we really have a lot of fragmented information. And so this is a great opportunity to pull this information together. We also, as mentioned before, there's not only one approach to conservation. We really want to look at a variety of approaches and to recognize the different types of tools that are contributing to conservation. And we want to make sure that this is informed by public comments and by tribal consultation. So we are now in the process of bringing together readily available authoritative data and assembling it in a map viewer. And then we'll be drafting, narrative about how these types of areas are contributing to the goals of America the Beautiful. So, NOAA has several authorities that allow us to contribute to America the Beautiful. Again, you may be pretty familiar with these. Some of them are focused on marine protected areas, like the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. Others are more around, different kinds of partnerships. The Coastal Zone Management Act, which works closely with states to ensure compatible uses in the coastal zone, and the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, which focuses on the management of federal fisheries, and then, of course, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, and the Antiquities Act. So we have a lot of tools that allow us to contribute to these goals. And so here are some examples of recent interagency progress. Restoring conditions or management measures in the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument, launching the Federal Interagency Council on Outdoor Recreation, signing an interagency memorandum on an MOU on promoting equitable access to nature in nature-deprived communities, launching the Public-Private America the Beautiful Challenge Grant campaign, and bipartisan infrastructure law investments. So you can see that there's a fair amount of work that has been done just over the past 2 years in in implementing America the Beautiful. And some examples specifically within NOAA include expanding the National Marine Sanctuary System and the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. And funding projects under the National Fish Habitat Partnership and the Gulf Corps' jobs and restoration projects, and targeted actions to halt the decline of threatened and endangered species. And so these include species that are most at the risk of extinction. So in terms of sanctuaries, as you can see on this map, this is the existing National Marine Sanctuary System, and the yellow squares are proposed National Marine Sanctuaries. So you can see that there are 4 proposed National Marine Sanctuaries that are currently undergoing public processes for to consider designation in Lake Ontario, Hudson Canyon, the Chumash Heritage in California, and Papahanaumokuakea in the Pacific Islands, which is currently now a marine national monument and would be designated as a national marine sanctuary. And there are a lot of aspects of designating a national marine sanctuary. I just wanted to mention a few that have kind of become important in this latest group. Engaging stakeholders through pre-designation advisory councils. For years, we have had sanctuary advisory councils to advise superintendents on the management of these places. And these are made up of diverse stakeholders who really provide a very detailed and balanced slate of local and regional expertise who can help inform sanctuaries management. And just recently, we've been establishing some of these councils in advance of designation to really ensure that we're getting that early involvement from local stakeholders. Sanctuaries has also been exploring new governance structures with Indigenous peoples. You saw that recognizing tribal sovereignty and supporting Indigenous-led conservation are principles and areas of early action for America the Beautiful. And one of the proposed sanctuaries, Chumash Heritage, has been really looking at what kinds of governance structures can we create to ensure that both federally recognized tribes and other tribal organizations have a voice in management and are able to contribute their expertise and knowledge to the management of this area. And also for all of the sites, identifying options for boundaries and management actions. And then for the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, these are smaller partnerships between NOAA and the states, and in some cases universities, that manage areas for research, education, and stewardship in estuarine areas. So they're really living laboratories to understand what's happening in these places, and particularly having reference areas that allow us to understand estuarine systems. And so there are now 30 of these areas established around the United States in widely diverse ecosystems. And there are potential designations being explored in Louisiana, Lake Michigan, and the US Virgin Islands. So really seeing a lot of interest among state partners and local people in establishing additional national estuarine research reserves. I also just wanted to mention these historic investments that have been made in coastal resilience, habitat, and fisheries through the bipartisan infrastructure law. The bill over the next 5 years is going to invest over $1.4 billion for climate-ready coasts, including natural infrastructure, habitat restoration, and carbon storage, and almost $600 million for fisheries and protected resources. And then in addition to that, the Inflation Reduction Act over the next 4 years is putting $2.6 billion into NOAA and through NOAA to its partners to build the nation's resilience to climate change, including research, conservation, restoration, and protection for coastal and marine ecosystems. So this is a huge win for the coast and marine areas in terms of, and the communities that depend on them. in terms of really benefiting from some of this large-scale investment. I also wanted to mention that the U.S. is going to be conducting its first ever national nature assessment. So this is for us to understand, the state of biodiversity in the U.S. As I mentioned, I think one of the things that has really come to light with America the Beautiful is the need for better information on biological diversity, both on land and in the ocean. And so this nature assessment is going to be conducted under the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and it will assess the status, trends, and future projections of lands, waters, wildlife, biodiversity, and ecosystems. So this will be, a really important milestone for us to better understand the state of nature in the United States, and also, spatially to understand where some of these most important places are. And of course, this will be a very public process in terms of engaging the public and learning about, what people's priorities are for understanding and using this information, and how Indigenous knowledge can contribute to our understanding. And then I also wanted to mention that NOAA is establishing a Marine and Coastal Area-Based Management Advisory Committee. So this is a new federal advisory committee that will advise NOAA on science-based approaches to area-based protection, conservation, restoration, and management. And so this is a really great opportunity to have ongoing advice from stakeholders, not just through public comment periods, but through a committee that can regularly engage with NOAA and provide a deeper consideration of the issues, and really allow people to come together from different perspectives and talk through the questions and concerns that they have, and provide that consensus recommendations to the agency. So we have just closed recently a call for members to this committee, and we are reviewing those applications and hope to be convening that committee later this spring or summer. And I also just wanted to note that if any of you are interested in kind of keeping up with NOAA and what we're doing on America the Beautiful, there is a website, noaa.gov/America-the-beautiful. And we can put that in the chat. But basically, that is a good place to go just to make sure that you have all the latest information on what that NOAA is doing, including progress reports, press releases, etc. So we are now going to dive into the Conservation Atlas. And so these are some of the things that Mimi is going to talk about, and that have certainly come up in the interagency discussions about the Atlas. What places count when we talk about conservation? How do we account for overlapping layers of conservation that add value? And really, engaging with the public and stakeholders and asking, what do conservation outcomes mean to you when we're talking about areas that contribute to conservation? What does that look like? So I'm going to stop here and hand the screen over to Mimi and let her kind of take you through some of the considerations that we're thinking about there. All right, Mimi, so hopefully, yep, your screen is showing.
Great. Can you hear me?
I can, yep.
Wonderful, thanks. Thanks, Lauren, for the introduction. I think super helpful to lay the foundation of America the Beautiful. And I'm just going to dig in a little bit to the challenge that we're facing on putting data to words, is sort of how I look at it, is that we have the America the Beautiful initiative laid out. It's highly inclusive. It looks to track conservation in a very inclusive, broad way. And my challenge and our challenge collectively across the government is to compile the information that's going to help us understand what conservation means and actually put that on a map, which is a challenging endeavor. I won't get into the background, but America the Beautiful is what has got us to this place, this initiative, which I like to think is, it is called 30 by 30, but it's really this call to action to get our ducks in a row to understanding all the ways that we're contributing to conservation outcomes, and actually to identify both the strengths and the weaknesses in those approaches, and identify the opportunities to improve how we approach conservation in the marine space as well as the terrestrial. An interesting part is the Conservation and Stewardship Atlas has forced the terrestrial and marine folks to really talk. And I think it's been very eye-opening to realize that if we map things from terrestrial and marine side, we will have gaps, but if we look at mapping all of US lands and waters together, we have opportunities to see where the terrestrial and the marine connect. So that's been a really great, I think, win with the Conservation and Stewardship Atlas. This atlas, as I've shown here, we have the concept of an atlas to me as a book of maps. And really that's sort of what we're thinking with the initial version of the atlas is layers that can help us inform conservation trends and track conservation progress. In words, that sounds easy, but that means that we need to compile all these layers of data and look for data that is consistent across the seascape and the landscape, all the way from Guam to the Caribbean to the Great Lakes. And that's actually been quite a challenge to find national scale consistent coverage data. I'm not going to read through the story map. We can provide the link and you can review the text, but really I'm just going to hit on the highlights. Really what we've learned through this conversation, and that's really what I'd like to share, is the learning that we're experiencing from working together with the terrestrial and marine communities, is that conservation happens across a very wide spectrum. And while I work with MPAs, we really have recognized that the way that we manage space is diverse, and it's really important for us to look at the continuum of conservation and recognize contributions that we may not have traditionally considered through other avenues. And this conceptual graphic here has helped us to realize that when we're looking at area-based management, that to understand conservation potential, there's a lot of ingredients, some of which we have data for, others which we don't. And as I said, that helps us identify some of the gaps that we have moving forward, and hopefully that will give us energy to fill those gaps moving forward. So looking at this graphic, you can see that some of the things that contribute to how an area increases conservation potential what is it designed to protect or to manage? How is it governed equitably to achieve the long-term conservation goals? How is it regulated? What types of laws and regulations are in place to monitor and protect the resources that are the intended management focus? And of course, this is a really tricky piece, the monitoring and the enforcement part. So we can have governance and we can have really good intent and governance and regulations, but if we're not enforcing those regulations and monitoring the health of the resources, that is a big gap in the potential conservation outcomes. And the trickiest part with monitoring too is this is really a difficult data piece. And similarly with ecosystem services, this is a lot of conversation around what does an ecosystem provide and what functions does it support. And while theoretically that is definitely a contributor to conservation outcomes, really putting that information on a map is very challenging. So I think this exercise so far has helped us to realize that there's lots of different ways we manage space, and when we're looking for America the Beautiful, we need to think about carbon contributions, we need to think about sustainable fisheries, we need to think about historical and cultural values, as well as biodiversity, as well as equitable access to nature. So trying to capture this all is the goal. And I think it's really important to remember that this will be iterative and that it's a learning process, and that I would argue we're at the initial stages of understanding how to track conservation over time. And on the marine side particularly, it has made us step into understanding the seascape of marine management, looking at all the different ways in which we manage space, and actually trying to put those on a map. So, here's a graphic of what, I'm talking about here, but here is a draft map that we put together that sort of helps us to understand all the different ways that we're managing ocean space. So in here, I'm going to highlight in these maps. I'm not going to dig into everything, but what I want to show you is some of the layers that we've started to compile. looking at just different ways that polygons in the sea that have regulations that would be of interest to understanding how we manage space. So National Marine Fisheries Service provides us a variety of layers where we have areas managed for fisheries. And Ocean Service, we have things like MPAs, we have marine managed areas for safety and other this is protected seas, includes fishing regulations and anything that relates to living resource extraction. We have de facto marine protected areas, so areas that are protected for things other than conservation. See, I won't turn these on. This one looks like it's having trouble. The military management boundaries, oil and gas withdrawal areas, and the variety of other boundaries in the sea that have laws associated with them and regulatory actions as well. So, what we've provided this map that can give you information on each of the areas, and you can click on and off with these layers. So, I'll turn on some of these just to give you a sense of the craziness of what we're talking about. Is that we have a lot of different management areas, and this includes the dots here of restoration projects. So the point here with this map is to show you that it's a complex fabric of management, and trying to understand how to take this from polygons in the sea to areas of conservation that count is a unique challenge that is presented to us. And I threw this in here because what counts seems to be the loaded question, and there has been a lot of public comment on this topic, and the take-home message is that conservation means different things to different people in different places, and understanding that is going to be essential to how we communicate and message this conservation progress for America the Beautiful. I think we're looking at this in a very sensitive way to try to recognize all these different contributions, and that one number on what counts is not going to suffice to communicate the breadth of ways that we contribute to conservation throughout U.S. waters. So to that effect of, we've talked about here already the boundaries, what we're managing, the space that we're managing, but what's actually happening in some of those boundaries. And of course, my computer is going to be very sluggish because we're doing this presentation. But let's start to look at all the different things that contribute to conservation and the different things other than managed areas. So I'll turn off the managed areas here because that's what's chugging the system here. But the different ways that we manage, there's a few there that we've added here for visualization. And then ecosystem services, things like critical habitat and seagrass distribution. Not just what boundaries there are for management, what's inside of those boundaries, and trying to capture the different pieces of information that we have that are at a national scale, and recognizing that there's a lot of information that we would want to have to understand what's actually being managed that we don't have consistently over space and time, really. So I think this exercise so far has identified that, first of all, we do have some amazing data assets to work with, but that if we want to give a fair shake to everybody, regardless of place and geography, we need to start to build better national scale data assets that help us understand collectively and comparatively what we're managing and how we're managing ocean resources. So again, a bunch of different data layers here. We have, shipwrecks and the Bureau of Indian Affairs regional boundaries and World Maritime Heritage sites, marine sites, excuse me. And so that's, just some of the cultural value data that we're trying to integrate. And then of course, there's information on threats. Threats, including oil and gas and unexploded ordnance. I'm going to try to load the vessel traffic. This can be very sluggish. Looking at where we have significant vessel traffic, things like harmful algal blooms and disposals at sea and whatnot. Again, this is intended to be just a visual of some of the things that we're looking at that have national scale assets to connect to. And there's also a long list, I will say, of data that we wish list that we'd like to have that would help us to really fill out what's happening across ocean space, and what are the resources that we're aiming to protect, and what's the health of those resources as well. So what's needed? I've already said this. There's so many data gaps across the marine realm, and really, I do want to say that it's not that they're true gaps, it's just that data are patchy. We have really good data in some places and no data in others. And that makes it difficult even to model across the national seascape. And so really trying to identify where those gaps are so that we can inform, new efforts to fill in those gaps to make the models more robust. And, the other thing is that while data is a really good, important part for the analytics, we also want to be thinking about the messages that we want to come out of this conversation around America the Beautiful. And so the data will inform those stories. So we're looking for the data so we can create the analytics so that we can build stories to help people connect to conservation in various different ways. And, the last part of this is about reporting units. And this sounds like, why would we bring this in? But in the terrestrial realm, if you've ever looked at some of the data that's out there, it's very nested scales. We have data analyzed over a zip code, and then maybe over a county or a watershed, and then we look at over a state or a region. We don't have defined nested geospatial scales across the marine environment. So it makes it very hard for us to compare terrestrially when we do analytics. So this reporting units piece is really designed to show you that, see if I can turn this on here, that there's various different ways that we can cut up the ocean environment. Let's see if I can make it launch. It's giving me a hard time here. Apologies. Here we go. That, there's different units that we can look at for analytics. And, some of that here shows we have the ecoregions. That's the most common reporting unit is across marine space is the CEC ecoregions, which I think we have like 28 or something across the marine space. So those are big, and it would be great if we had smaller units with which we could analyze, barring just using pixels, which are, what's the word that I'm looking for? They are arbitrary, and they're not defined by any biogeographic or other related indicator. So, we're stuck in looking at different ways of analyzing ocean space. And the really important part that I wanted to mention is that, and I didn't get this in previous conversation, but that in a lot of the areas that we have overlap of marine regulations and marine managed areas, and really trying to understand how those areas are affected cumulatively is really an important part for the conservation outcome. So if we look at one fishery management area, we may not have really significant regulations that would contribute to conservation. But when you look at the fact that one area has overlap of 20 different types of management, collectively that piece of ocean space has more conservation outcome potential than others. So the reporting units piece is really trying to get at, these various different boundaries that we have in the ocean that we can use depth contours, things like that. We can use, and this again shows the ones for the land as well. Census boundaries include state waters, so we can include things like that as ways to cut things up. Basically right now too, we've been using federal and state waters, which looks at, the areas within state waters analytically, as well as then the big area that's federal waters. But that doesn't really tell a robust story. So trying to understand how to dig in and look at what I call here the denominator data. So, this is really the part that, we look at how much area is conserved, and then we have to divide by an area to get a percent. And we really don't have a strong handle, believe it or not, on what those denominators should be. And similarly in the terrestrial zone. So that's the final piece is the denominator. And I'll end with the nested scales need. in order to understand patterns and trends, we need to look, locally and regionally and nationally. We need to be able to dig in and analyze at different spatial scales to be able to tell different types of stories. So we're really looking at how best to do that effectively, and whether that's through using big pixels in the ocean, or it's using things like the ecoregions to communicate status and trends. And I want to sort of wrap here with, the atlas is not just a statistical tool. It will really be designed, just like back to the vision of the book, the atlas book, to tell stories, to show through visualization patterns and trends, and also to tell stories about conservation. So we do intend to include metrics like the marine protected area coverage and no-take marine reserves. We hope that users will be able to glean that information, but also that the stories part. So the stories both that help support the analytics, but also the stories that tell what folks are doing on the ground and how that's contributing. So I think the way I look at this is that we hope that through the atlas, people can see themselves in the atlas. They can see the work that's happening in their local communities through the atlas. They can see that the atlas is not just about marine protected areas and areas like national parks, but that it has a broader picture that recognizes the different ways that conservation is happening across different scales. And here are some of the buzzes of stories that are being developed, and that either are developed or are being developed for the atlas. We have some amazing story maps already compiled that help us to tell those stories. And again, that's hit on biodiversity, climate resilience, and equitable access to nature. So really trying to focus on those three themes. So stories are a really important part of connecting the data to people and actually translating the data into actionable information. So stories will be a big part of the atlas as it grows. Again, through stories, we can connect people to place. We can take information that connects the local user to the big picture of conservation. So that helps us to sort of advance the impact of the atlas, and hopefully getting folks to engage and provide feedback on what is missing. So some of the take-home messages here is that the atlas, while it's designed to really conservation trends across U.S. lands and waters, it's not just quantitative, but it's intended to be qualitative. It's designed to be a visual tool as well as an analytical tool. And I'll say right now, we don't have a defined framework that will be used to track a conservation statistic. There's been a lot of dialogue on this, and I think one of the main questions that remains is what is biodiversity and what is conservation outcomes? How do we define those terms so that they are inclusive of the spirit of America the Beautiful, which includes, recognition of the various different ways that we approach conservation. The atlas will be rich with stories that highlight both the successes and the opportunities at varying scales, and that there is the plan for an initial launch in the spring of 2023. So that's rapidly, that's coming up. And so we rapidly approaching. So work is underway to have a beta version for public release soon. So that's the story that I have for you. The data side, as I'll end and wrap here, is the data side is tricky. And writing the words down, so looking at a document about what America the Beautiful is in words is one thing, but finding the data to track to those has definitely presented its fair share of challenges. And I do think that the intent is to be data rich and very inclusive of all of the public comment that we've heard. And that is the spirit that we're going with moving forward. So I think I'll wrap with that. And if folks have questions, I think we can open the floor. Thanks for your time.